Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and joining me as always to unpack the sources is our resident expert.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
So today we are tackling the 1920s. And when you picture the 1920s, I mean, your brain probably defaults to the Baz Luhrmann version, right?
Oh, yeah.
You know, The Great Gatsby, see the flappers, the jazz bands, Al Capone, and just this endless glittering party. It is sort of the ultimate American highlight reel.
It's the iconic image, for sure. The Roaring '20s.
Yeah.
But, highlight reels are usually editing out something ugly.
And that is exactly the twist we found in the sources for today. What if that entire decade, that whole massive party, wasn't just people having a good time? What if the roar was actually a scream?
Yeah, a trauma response.
Exactly, a desperate reaction to the absolute chaos that came before it. So our mission for this deep dive is to sort of flip the script on the Jazz Age.
Right.
We are going to trace how the U.S. went from the violence of 1919 into this manic episode of isolation and spending, and finally why the crash of 1929 was mathematically inevitable.
And for those of you listening, this isn't just about stock prices dropping. We really need to figure out why a country would deliberately lock its doors to the world, buy everything on credit, and then just watch it all burn down.
Let's start with the Polaria. Because in the standard high school history version, World War I ends in 1918, everyone cheers, and then the party starts.
Right, the neat timeline.
But the documents paint a picture of 1919 that looks less like a party and more like, well, a horror movie.
1919 was arguably one of the most chaotic years in American history. You really have to understand the psychology here.
Okay.
The war ends. Soldiers come home expecting to just return to their old lives. But the economy had been running entirely on war production.
Making weapons, uniforms.
Exactly. So suddenly the government cancels billions in contracts. Factories shut down. There are no jobs.
And the inflation was completely out of control.
It was. So you have unemployed veterans and workers whose paychecks are suddenly worthless.
And the data shows the scale of this. Nearly 1 in 5 workers nationwide went on strike in 1919.
1 in 5. That is the highest proportion in U.S. history.
Wow.
It wasn't just a labor dispute, it genuinely felt like a revolution. I mean, in Seattle, the entire city shut down for a general strike.
And this tension didn't stay in the factories. It spilled out into the streets, specifically regarding race. The notes use this term, the Red Summer.
Yeah, the Red Summer. This is the really ugly aftermath of the Great Migration.
Right, because during the war, African Americans had moved north to fill those vacant factory jobs.
Yes. And when the white soldiers returned, they wanted those jobs back. And they wanted the housing back. It created intense competition.
The sources detail race riots in dozens of cities: Chicago, East St. Louis, and of course later on, the devastating Tulsa massacre where hundreds of blocks were burned.
It was a nationwide explosion of racial violence, white mobs attacking black communities. And crucially, for the first time, black veterans were fighting back.
It was essentially a war zone on American soil.
It really was.
So you have massive strikes, you have race riots, and then on top of that you have the Red Scare.
The fear of Bolshevism.
Right, the fear that the communist revolution in Russia was going to happen right here in the U.S.
And the government actively fed that paranoia. I mean, a bomb actually exploded on the front porch of the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer.
Which gives us the Palmer Raids.
Exactly. After that, Palmer essentially suspended the Constitution. They rounded up thousands of suspected radicals, socialists, immigrants.
Just mass roundups.
No warrants, no trials, just mass deportations, many sent to the Soviet Union.
So let's pause and just look at the mindset of the average person in 1920. You have survived a world war. You survived the Spanish flu, you are watching race riots and seeing your neighbors deported.
You are completely exhausted, you're traumatized, and you just want all of it to stop.
Enter Warren G. Harding.
The perfect candidate for a tired nation. He didn't promise any big sweeping changes.
He promised a return to normalcy.
Right.
His whole slogan was, not nostrums, but normalcy, which is such a boring slogan, but it clearly worked.
Because it was exactly what people wanted. It was a complete rejection of everything Woodrow Wilson stood for. Wilson wanted America to lead the world, to join the League of Nations.
Then Harding basically said, no, let's worry about America. Let's close the door.
Let's focus inward, yes.
And when we say close the doors, we really need to look at the immigration laws passed in the 20s. Because the math they used in the National Origins Act of 1924 is, well, it's deviously specific.
It is social engineering via statistics.
Tell us how that worked.
They set a quota. They decided that only 2% of the people from a specific country currently living in the U.S. could immigrate each year.
Okay. Sounds like standard math.
But here's the catch. They didn't use the current 1920 census for that 2%.
Right. The notes say they went all the way back to the 1890 census. Why go back 34 years?
Because in 1890, the massive wave of Southern and Eastern Europeans, the Italians, the Jews, the Poles, they hadn't arrived yet.
Oh.
If they used the 1920 census, millions of them could still come in. By using 1890 data, the baseline for those groups was tiny, so their quota became virtually zero.
So they deliberately rigged the data to keep America looking a very specific way.
To return to traditional views on domestic policy, Calvin Coolidge was actually quite blunt about it when he signed the bill. He said, "America must be kept American."
It was pure nativism. They were blaming immigrants for the strikes and the radicalism of 1919.
Exactly. And this nativism brings us to the resurgence of the KKK. But the research points out this wasn't the same Klan from the Reconstruction era right after the Civil War.
No, the sources call this the new KKK, and it was much more mainstream, wasn't it?
Very mainstream. It wasn't just in the South anymore. It was huge in the Midwest and the West. And it wasn't exclusively anti-Black.
They expanded their targets.
They diversified their hate.
Yay.
They were anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant. They even opposed modern women. They positioned themselves as a fraternal organization, protecting traditional white Protestant values. At their peak, they had millions of members. They even held a massive march down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., with their faces fully exposed.
It is genuinely terrifying to think about that level of mainstream acceptance. So on one hand, you have this intense pressure to conform, to be 100% American and traditional, but then paradoxically, the culture goes in the complete opposite direction.
This is the roaring part of the 20s.
The manic episode. If the politics were about control, the culture was all about losing control. It was pure escapism.
And nothing says escapism quite like spending money you don't actually have. This decade is really the birth of modern consumerism.
It really is. Before the 20s, the rule was generally if you couldn't afford it in cash, you didn't buy it. But then came installment plans.
Buying on credit.
Right. Suddenly, a regular factory worker could own a radio, a vacuum cleaner, and a Model T Ford.
And the advertising shifted to match this new credit culture. They stopped selling the utility of the product and started selling the feeling.
They sold the euphoria.
Exactly. The car wasn't just transportation anymore. It was freedom. It was privacy. Which, by the way, completely changed the dating scene. You could finally leave the front porch away from your parents.
Speaking of breaking rules and getting away from parents, we have to talk about prohibition. The government bans alcohol to improve public morality, and instead they just create a massive business opportunity for criminals.
It was perhaps the greatest unintended consequence in legislative history. By banning alcohol, they made it tax-free and totally unregulated.
And highly profitable.
Extremely. Al Capone and the Chicago outfit were making $100 million a year. That is billions in today's money.
And it turned average, everyday citizens into criminals just for wanting a drink.
That is the key psychological shift. It completely eroded respect for the law. If the local judge and the police officer are meeting you at the speakeasy for a drink, the law loses its moral authority entirely.
It made rebellion cool.
Exactly.
We see that same rebellion in the idea of the new woman, too, the flapper.
Short skirts, bobbed hair, smoking in public. It was a visual, physical rejection of their mother's strict Victorian values.
But there's a political context there, too, right?
Definitely. Women had just won the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. The social rebellion of the flapper was kind of the victory lap, even though organized political activism actually started to wane a bit during the decade.
Now, while this cultural shift was happening in white America, there was a parallel explosion of culture happening in Black America, the Harlem Renaissance.
This is a crucial piece of the era. You have the Great Migration concentrating all this talent in cities like New York. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston.
They were really defining what it meant to be Black in America on their own terms.
They weren't asking for permission from white society anymore. They were asserting the new Negro identity. It was proud, vibrant, and defiant.
But the sources show that even within that empowerment movement, there were very different philosophies. You had the NAACP pushing for legal integration, but then you had Marcus Garvey.
Yeah.
And his approach was entirely different.
It was very radical for the time. Garvey looked at the race riots of 1919, the rise of the new KKK, the systemic segregation, and he essentially said, integration's a fantasy. White America is never going to accept us.
So his solution was total separation.
Yes. Negro nationalism, he wanted Black ownership of businesses, total self-sufficiency.
And he founded the UNIA.
The Universal Negro Improvement Association. It became a massive global mass movement. He even launched the Black Star Line, which was a shipping company meant to facilitate global trade and a literal back-to-Africa migration.
It's fascinating because he was wildly popular with the working class, while black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois thought his separatist ideas were dangerous.
Garvey was offering a very tangible form of hope and dignity to people who felt abandoned. But the government saw him as a massive threat and eventually deported him on charges of mail fraud.
So let's look at the scoreboard by roughly 1928. The stock market is soaring. Almost everyone seems to have a car. Cities are booming. On paper, it looks like a golden age. What were the signs of economic trouble that people were just ignoring?
The biggest structural crack was extreme inequality. The prosperity was incredibly top-heavy.
How top-heavy?
The stats are staggering. Just 0.5 to 1% of the population controlled over a third of all the wealth.
Wow.
Meanwhile, 80% of American families had no savings at all. Zero.
So they were just living paycheck to paycheck.
Paycheck to paycheck, or more accurately, paycheck to credit payment. And then there were the farmers. They were a huge part of the country's population, and they had been in a severe depression for the entire decade.
Because of overproduction from the war years.
Exactly. They grew too much, crop prices plummeted, and they were drowning in debt. They definitely weren't roaring.
And the manufacturing boom in the cities was starting to hit a wall too, right? I mean, there are only so many radios you can sell.
Market saturation. By 1929, auto sales were slowing down. Residential construction was dropping. The real businesses making actual goods were starting to make less money.
But the stock market just kept going up. If companies are selling fewer cars and making less money, why are their stocks getting more expensive?
Pure speculation. People stopped looking at the actual value of the company and just started betting on the direction of the line.
The belief that it would just go up forever.
And crucially, they were buying on margin.
Okay, buying on margin. I want to pause here because you hear that term a lot when people talk about 1929. How did that actually work for a regular investor back then?
Think of it like this. You have $10. You want to buy $100 worth of stock.
Okay.
You put down your $10 and you borrow the other $90 from your stockbroker.
So I am 90% in debt on this one trade.
Right. But if the stock goes up to $150, you sell it, pay back the $90 you owe the broker, and you have made a massive profit using mostly someone else's money. It felt like magic.
But if the stock drops...
That is the trap. If the stock drops to, say, $80, the broker gets nervous. He issues a margin call and demands his $90 back immediately.
And if I don't have it?
He sells your stock at a loss, and you are left with nothing. Actually, worse than nothing. You still owe the balance of the debt.
And everyone was doing this.
It was a national mania. Shoe shiners, cooks, bankers, everyone believed the market was invincible. They were trading on pure optimism and borrowed cash.
Until October 1929, when the bill finally comes due.
The bubble burst. Black Tuesday. October 29th, 1929. Panic just completely set in.
16 million shares were dumped in a single day.
The market didn't just dip, it collapsed. It lost nearly half its value in a matter of months.
But here's the thing I always find confusing when reading about the crash. The sources say only about 10% of Americans actually own stock. So if the market crashes, why did the other 90% lose everything? How did the stock market crash affect other areas of the U.S. economy?
This is the critical piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just the stock market dropping that caused the Great Depression. It was the banking system.
Connect those dots for us.
The banks had been playing the exact same game. They took regular people's deposited savings and invested that money in the stock market. Or they lent it out to speculators buying on margin who now couldn't pay it back.
Oh.
So when the crash happened, the banks became completely insolvent. They physically did not have the money anymore.
So I'm a regular guy. I never bought a single stock in my life. I go down to my local bank to withdraw my life savings.
And the teller looks at you and says, "I'm sorry, it's gone."
And because there was no FDIC insurance back then to protect deposits.
It was just gone, vaporized into thin air.
Yeah.
And this reality caused massive bank runs. It was a psychological panic.
People heard a rumor a bank was in trouble, so everyone rushed to withdraw their cash at exactly the same time.
Which forces the bank to collapse. Thousands of banks failed this way.
And when banks fail, local businesses can't get loans to make payroll.
Exactly. So businesses shut down. Unemployment tripled from 1.5 million to 4.5 million in just 1 year. It was a devastating downward spiral.
And the U.S. dragged the rest of the world down with it.
We were the world's piggy bank after World War I. When our economy crashed, U.S. banks demanded immediate repayment of the loans they had given to Europe.
which pulled Germany and the Allies down too.
It went global almost immediately.
Visually, the country changes practically overnight. You go from building the shining Chrysler building to living in Hoovervilles.
Hoovervilles. These were massive shanty towns built out of scrap metal and cardboard in public parks and vacant lots.
And they named everything after the president, Herbert Hoover.
Out of pure bitterness, Hoover blankets were just old newspapers people used to keep warm. Hoover flags were empty pockets turned inside out.
And as if the economic collapse wasn't enough, nature decided to kick the country while it was down. The Dust Bowl.
The Dust Bowl was an ecological disaster, but it was caused by the exact same greed and overextension. Farmers had overfarmed the land during the boom years of the war, completely tearing up the natural prairie grass.
So when a severe drought hit the Midwest,
The topsoil just blew away in these massive apocalyptic dust storms. It destroyed the agricultural heartland, sending thousands of people, the Okies, fleeing toward California.
so Herbert Hoover, he's the guy holding the bag while the country literally turns to dust. The sources suggest he wasn't intentionally cruel, but he was incredibly rigid in his beliefs.
Right.
Why didn't he just use the government to help people?
It all came down to his philosophy of rugged individualism.
Rugged individualism.
He genuinely believed that if the federal government started giving direct handouts welfare, it would destroy the self-reliant spirit of the American soul.
So his plan was for local charities to fix a global economic collapse.
Basically, yes. He asked businesses very nicely not to fire their workers. He relied on volunteerism. But the scale of the problem was simply too massive for charity to fix.
And when he did try to pass federal policies, they seemed to backfire entirely, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff.
That was a complete disaster. He tried to protect American factories by placing massive taxes on imported goods.
But Europe just retaliated.
Exactly, they taxed American goods in return. Global trade basically ground to a halt. It just made the depression much, much deeper.
But the moment that really ended Hoover's presidency, the moment that seems to finally break the spirit of the country, was the Bonus Army in 1932.
This is perhaps the most tragic chapter of the entire era. You have thousands of World War I veterans, the exact same men who fought for the country in 1918, marching on Washington, D.C.
Because they were starving and unemployed.
Right. They were legally owed a cash bonus for their service, payable in 1945. But they marched to demand that the government pay it early because they were desperate.
They set up camps right near the Capitol, and Hoover ordered them cleared out.
He did. He sent in the active duty U.S. Army, commanded by Douglas MacArthur. They used tanks and tear gas against American veterans and their families. They burned the shantytown right to the ground.
The image of the United States government tear gassing the same soldiers they had sent to war a decade earlier, that is just the end of the line.
It really was. It confirmed to the American public that Hoover was completely out of touch and heartless. It sealed his political fate and paved the way for Franklin D. Roosevelt to win in a landslide.
It really brings the story full circle. You start the decade with soldiers coming home to no jobs and rioting. You have this manic, trauma-fueled party of escapism in the middle, and you end with the government literally attacking those same soldiers in the mud of a shantytown.
It frames the 1920s not as a fun, carefree time, but as a massive warning sign. We tried to fix our collective trauma with endless consumption. We tried to create a sense of security by excluding immigrants and minorities. And we built a supposedly booming economy entirely on debt.
The return to normalcy turned out to be a detour straight into disaster.
Precisely. The sources show us that prosperity that isn't shared across the board and isn't based on real, tangible value is just a bubble waiting to burst. The foundation always matters more than the glitter on top.
A very sobering thought to keep in mind. Especially when you think about it. If the escapism of the 1920s was a direct reaction to the massive stress of World War I, how much of our current culture today is just a reaction to our own recent crises? And are we ignoring the structural cracks in our own foundation just like they did in 1928? Something for you to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See you next time.